Welcome to the Twin Bill Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Bolahan. Last month, there was a viral moment at the Rickwood Field game where Reggie Jackson spoke candidly about his experiences in the minors. And Mitchell Nathanson's book, Under Jackie's Shadow, Voices of Black Minor Leaguers Left Behind, is full of stories like that. He talked to 13 black minor leaguers about their experiences playing in the 60s and 70s, and show how even decades after Jackie Robinson was done playing, not much had changed. It's a really important book and very eye-opening. I hope you enjoy. Mitch, welcome to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Where did this idea come from? How did this start for you?
Well, I actually got the idea from one of the players I spoke to afterwards, who reached out, and eventually I got connected with, who played in the Phillies organization, and I had mentioned him in a biography I had written about Dick Allen, and so I mentioned him really briefly, and just as a minor league player who idolized and tried to emulate Allen, and then the Phillies didn't like that fact, and so I just kind of threw that in there in the Allen book, and he mentioned to me how, yeah, you spoke about Allen and what he had went through in Little Rock and everything, but there's a lot more players like him than there were of Dick Allen, and so he said, what about the players who don't make it? It's not the same story, even though people tend to think they're the same story. And I had never really thought about that. And I realized, well, of course he's correct. And so he really very badly wanted to tell me what his experience was like. And so I didn't know quite what to do with it. And so eventually I still didn't know what to do with it, but I thought that I wanted to know more. And so I listened to him, and I thought he had a really compelling story. And he was correct that his story is not at all like the stories that we know about um, players like Allen or Hank Aaron or Ernie Banks or Reggie Jackson, who spoke during the All-Star, the Rickwood Field game, pregame. Those players also had issues in the minor leagues because of their race, but it's different for them because they made it and they thrived. But people like this is Mickey Bowers didn't. And it's a lot different for them. And of course, there's many more like him than there are of Allen and Reggie Jackson. And so that's where the idea came from. And I started to think, wow, these are really interesting stories. And in a way, you're aware of them if you're involved in this at all. The stories of these players, the first generation after Jackie Robinson. But then another way, you're really not, because you don't really think about the ones who didn't make it. So. I thought that would be compelling, and I asked him if he knew other players who would be willing to talk, and he said sure. So he gave me a couple of names, and I was off. And so what I would do is every time I would speak to somebody, I'd ask that person for another name. Just give me one name of somebody else, and preferably from a different organization, so I didn't have all of the people just from one organization. And eventually I was able to put together, I spoke to a lot of people, but I felt I had 13 really complete narratives that have beginnings, middles, and ends. And so I was thinking about different ways of doing it, and I could have done it in terms of kind of, doing it by breaking it up subject-wise or era or whatever. But then I decided, you know what, I'm not going to do any of that. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to focus on the individuals themselves and let them tell their stories. And so that's how I ended up writing the book that I wrote.
I'm curious about, and you kind of get into this in the book too, the choice of making an oral history and sort of the struggle that goes along with that choice.
First of all, it's their stories and not my stories.
Mm-hmm.
And they're the ones who had the experience, and I didn't want to comment on the experience. The thing I could do is help them present their stories to a larger audience. And I thought if I did that, I would be doing a good thing. I really thought about this a lot. And I thought that, for me to comment on their stories, which would be essentially passing judgment on their stories and stuff like that, it just wouldn't be right. In a way, it's sort of compounding the problem. And I didn't want to do that. And so I thought this was the best way to do it. And then I learned in the process that even doing that presents their own problems, because there's, how do you take a 20, 30,000 word transcript, which is what I would end up with, and turn it into 4,500, 5,000 word essay. You just don't pick out a 5,000 word chunk and throw it in there, because there's a lot of stuff that comes at the beginning, the middle, the end, and stuff that somebody starts a story at one point and then they pick it up an hour later. You have to be able to put that together and mash things together such that it becomes a coherent narrative. And so there's all sorts of issues that are involved, are part of that process. And so that was difficult enough, to do that, and then also put it together such that I'm sort of commenting and passing judgment and deciding, what stories go with which other stories. I thought that was, compounding a problem.
When you approach these players, was there reluctance on their end, or was there an excitement to finally get their story out? What was their reaction?
So it depended on the person. Some people were very excited. Again, Mickey Bowers, since he was the one who reached out to me, he was excited. There were other people who were more hesitant, because for a lot of these people, these are things that happened a half a century ago. They were profoundly unpleasant, and really, who wants to bring that up half century later? What are you going to get out of it, really? And so for a lot of people, there was a hesitance. There was a few people who felt a great sense of relief of being able to finally talk about it. But that it depended on the person. There were some people who never got comfortable with it, and so I didn't end up using anything of theirs, and that's fine. Obviously, it's their story, not mine. So if they're not comfortable with it, that's perfectly okay. But yeah, I mean, some people were they were hesitant in for a while. There was one player, Chuck Stone, who was very hesitant. I spoke to him for over an hour, 90 minutes, maybe 2 hours, and he was giving me nothing. And just really, hey, it was a great time. It was fun. It didn't work out, but it was okay, whatever. And then after about 2 hours, he said, "Okay, all right, now I'll tell you the real story." And then he did. And so I think for that period of time, he was trying to figure out, can he trust me? Is this worth his time? Is this something that's worthwhile for him? And I think after that period of time, he decided it was. And so then he told me the story. Yeah. So that was, I had that with a few players, and it just goes to show that you have to just sort of let the person go at their own pace and let them talk about what they want to talk about. And I could kind of feel sometimes when somebody was more or less willing to talk, and you would bring up different subjects at different times, depending on the feeling that you would get or I would get in terms of like, where are they emotionally? And, sometimes it just takes some time for somebody to be comfortable. Other times they never get comfortable. Will Aaron was a guy who would tell you right out of the box. He was very upfront about everything that he went through, and so that's very different than Chuck Stone.
So you start the book off with Jackie Robinson at the 72 World Series. Why start there?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. Because I felt, first of all, at 72 ceremony, which was before the World Series game, where it was sort of presented as, hey, look what happened 25 years ago, and aren't we so much better now? And I thought that was interesting that they were, and Bowie Kuhn came out and, gave him some BS award, and Robinson saw right through it all, obviously, yeah. And Robinson wasn't having any of it. And so Robinson knew what it was. Everybody else was trying to kind of paste over what was going on, but Robinson wasn't. And I thought it was interesting. I don't remember seeing that live, but I remember seeing replays of it over the years. And I just remember that, Robinson was pretty forthright. He only spoke for, a couple of minutes, but he was pretty forthright, and it got just resoundingly ignored, whatever he said. And so one of the first things I did when I started thinking about how am I going to put this all together and introduce it all was I went back and I tried to see what was the reaction in the newspapers at the time, because that was my impression from the little that I knew. And I was in that nobody really had much to say about it. They just kind of said, well, he got an award before the game. Jackie Robinson got an award, and then the Reds played the A's. And that was really it. And there was really nothing. A couple of people wrote things like, Jackie Robinson came out and talked about bygone days or something like that. And it was just not accurate at all. And so I thought it would be interesting for just kind of lead it off with that, because I thought that Robinson understood that none of this was over and that it was very much a work in progress, and that a lot of people were treating it as if it were over, and that what he did was a one-time thing and then everything was fine. But he knew that it wasn't, and as much as anybody else wanted to treat it as like it was, he wasn't going to let that happen. Now, unfortunately, he died 9 days later. But he was pretty outspoken throughout his post playing days about how frustrated he was with both the progress and the narrative that had grown up around him, and he didn't like either. And he was really angry about this narrative that had kind of sprung up around him, and he was pushing back against it very hard. And I thought that that's what these players were examples of. They were examples of how right he was, and just how correct he was in everything he was saying, and how nobody wanted to see it. And so I thought that was a good way to bring people into the book. Also, it's a good way to bring people in the book because if you're reading a book about baseball, you probably know who Jackie Robinson is, and that's something you can hang on to. Whereas the players in the book, by definition, are players that nobody had ever heard of. I mean, maybe a few, but most people had probably not heard of any of these guys. Maybe one. If you were a longtime fan, maybe you heard of one or two of these guys, but only in passing. And so I thought it was important to kind of ground it in something that people, or somebody that people would know, in order to understand better all these people they don't know, and to kind of put in place, well, here's why you might not know who these people are. And it's not just because they weren't good enough.
I thought it was a great way to start the book off, especially because there is a sort of prevailing narrative that once Jackie broke the color barrier, everything was fine. Everything was like, oh, we did it. Good job. Let's pat ourselves on the back. And these players you talk to, they are from the 60s and 70s minor leaguers, which is, I believe, when the highest percentage of African Americans are playing baseball still. And they are essentially still dealing with the same problems that Jackie had decades before. And it really kind of made it stick for me. Put it all in perspective.
Yeah, that's exactly the point. That some of these guys are a quarter century later, if not more, and they're dealing with the same things. They're in organized baseball, which of course is something that would not have happened before 1947, but the amount of progress that had been made was nowhere near as great as people thought. I wrote something years ago about Branch Rickey, and how I thought that the way people understand the Jackie Robinson story is really a Branch Rickey story, and how this people they sort of make it into a story about, look at this great thing Branch Rickey did. And Robinson's, he's a part of it, but it's a great thing that Branch Rickey did, and therefore the problem was solved. But I as I've written elsewhere, I think that not only is that not true, but it made things worse in the decades later, because by we're sort of framing this as here's a beneficent thing that Branch Rickey did. It sort of took the problem off of the table for Major League Baseball and said, well, we don't have to really fix it. There'll be enough guys like Branch Rickey, and there were some others. There was Bill Veeck in Cleveland, and there were other
Yep.
people as the 50s went on, and you would see a smattering of players, and then more and more, and things like that. But there was only a smattering, and it was sort of just left to these individuals who who were discriminating their whole lives against black players to now be in charge of integrating it. And there's no way that's going to go well. It just won't. It isn't metaphorically the same people. It is literally the same people. So these are people who literally kept blacks out of baseball for decades. And you're saying to the same people, we're going to leave it to you to figure out how to do this, to integrate the game. Well, of course, these things are going to continue for decades. And these people were running these franchises. They were part of the scouting systems. They were part of the farm systems. They were the general managers. They were the assistants to general managers. These were people who were there for decades, who were just segregationists, and now we're just deferring to them to become integrationists. Of course, this stuff is going to happen. How could it not happen? And it did happen. And so that's that. So to me, that whole story is just it's a skewing of events, and very detrimental in practice, because it led to all of these things that I think you saw for decades in baseball that maybe you otherwise wouldn't have seen if there was instead a court ruling, or there was a piece of legislation, as there were pieces of legislation in certain states to mandate integration in all areas, including baseball. Not all states, but New York certainly had a couple of different things on the table. And Branch Rickey showed up and kind of swept all that away. And because of that, there never was any. And because there never was any, there was no real right for blacks to play baseball. And that's why we ended up with what we ended up with.
There are plenty of examples in the book of very overt racism. I was particularly interested in some of the more subtle, institutionalized kind of racism. Will Aaron is a great example. Hank Aaron's cousin. He's a second baseman. He wants to play the infield, and they force him into the outfield. And it sounds like that was a pretty common practice at the time.
Yeah, and in fact, when he was playing, he used to keep track of, as far as he could tell, within at least the organizations he was in or the leagues he was in, the number of black players at certain positions. And he could see, not that you had to keep a chart to see this, you just have to go to the games and you could see it. But he would keep track of, well, how many black shortstops are there, how many black pitchers, how many black catchers, compared to how many black outfielders and how many black first basemen, right? And as he found, it's hard enough to advance and make the major leagues in the best of circumstances. But when they're going to remove the possibility of you competing on maybe half of the positions on the field, it becomes that much more difficult. And as he said, I was 5'8", 155 as a middle infielder, and he was very clear-eyed about his abilities. He never thought he was going to be a superstar, but he thought, as a middle infielder, I could probably advance and maybe make the major leagues, but not as an outfielder. And so, as he said, once they put you in the outfield, you're not competing against the likes of, going back to the 70s when he was playing, the middle infielders who were playing then. You had guys like Don Kessinger and Roger Metzger. I mean, these were pretty horrible hitters. These guys could not hit. Then they were in the major leagues and they were starting, right? And if these guys are starting, I don't know, who's the guy sitting behind Don Kessinger? That guy's got to be a pretty sad player. But as he said, I have a shot. I have a shot to be in the big leagues if those guys are in the big leagues. But you put me in the infield, now I'm competing against Bobby Bonds, and I'm competing against guys like Willie Mays, and all of the great outfielders who can hit with power, who do more things. He says, well, I can't compete against that. And he wasn't even drafted as an outfielder. He was drafted as a middle infielder. And so he says, when you take someone like him and put him in a position where he has no chance to succeed, and then you tell him he didn't succeed, well, of course he didn't succeed. But why didn't he succeed? And his point was they would continually tell black players they weren't good enough, but again, they wouldn't put him in the positions where they had an opportunity to succeed. And if you don't give them an opportunity to succeed, well, they're most likely not going to succeed. And that's what happened.
Do you have any idea why that happened? Do the players talk about that?
Yeah, well, he did. He was very, very clear about the assumption that the catchers and the shortstops were the leaders on the team, and you had to have a white guy there. You couldn't have a black guy there. And this goes back to the same thing in football for decades, where you couldn't have a black quarterback and you couldn't have a black middle linebacker. Right? There were certain positions where black players just wouldn't get a chance, and for the same reason. Right? This idea that that is an intellectual position, so we can't have a black guy there, which of course is BS, but that's what held people back. And so on the baseball diamond, it's the same thing. And so that's why he said, well, I'm not going to get a shot in the middle of the infield. I'm going to get a shot in the outfield where I don't have a chance. And so, he says the results are, you could predict the results. You could predict that this is going to happen.
There's one other example I was really struck by. John Thompson, who was a switch hitter, and they forced him to hit right. What is his story?
The scouting director or whoever was saw him taking batting practice one day, and he saw him as a right-handed hitter, and because he was just practicing swings, but he actually was a switch hitter, and they just said, no, you're just going to hit right-handed. We're not going to let you switch hit. And he couldn't convince anybody to let him do the thing that made him a special player. And as he said, you take away half my game if you don't let me do that. So he felt like he didn't really have an opportunity to compete because this is the thing he did well. He was a good switch hitter. They would never let him do it because one guy one day saw him hitting right-handed against a right-handed pitcher, and they're like, well, okay, that's what you are. You're a right-handed hitter, and don't waste our time by trying to learn how to switch hit. When he could say over and over, but I am a switch hitter. None of that mattered. And so I asked him, well, did you complain or say anything? And his response was, well, if you complain, then you're known as a complainer. And if you're known as a complainer, that's another way out of the organization. And all this comes back to the thing that I started off talking about, which was if you were a superstar talent, or if you were a guy that they had invested a lot in, you maybe could say something. It's true, they might see you as a complainer. Okay, use Dick Allen again as an example. He would speak up for himself in the minor leagues. And yeah, everybody who knows the story about Dick Allen knows that he was labeled a malcontent from before he got to the big leagues. He was just really speaking out for himself. But still, even there, they had invested $70,000, $80,000 in a signing bonus for him. He was going to advance, even though there were people in the organization who thought he was a malcontent because he would speak up for himself. But if you weren't a guy that they had invested that much in, they would just release you. And that's what John Thompson was saying, that I knew enough to know that if I had started speaking out, or if I had just gone to the plate once and switch hit, right, just to do it, they'd throw my ass out of this organization in a second. There's no way that I would be able to survive that. I mean, Will Aaron tells a story about a bunch of on a bus and going from one city to another, and a bunch of his white teammates stuck their asses out the window and mooned a couple of girls who were in another car. And he watched this and he's like, if a black guy ever did that, they'd release him in a second. But because it's a bunch of white guys, it's just white kids having fun. So he says, you're right. He says, that's like a small thing, but it's sort of telling. And like, there's two different ways that players get treated. And he said, I saw things that my white teammates did that I knew that if I ever did them, I'm gone. I'm gone within 24 hours.
How did these experiences affect these players and their relationship with the game? I mean, obviously none of them became big stars or anything like that. What did it do for them in their life?
I thought that it was interesting that, well, first of all, they all ended their careers in organized baseball on unpleasant notes. Now, you could also say the same for major league players, right? Because very few major league players go out on their own terms. But these guys in particular had bad endings, and for a lot of them, they had a tough time. At least in terms of their relationship with baseball. For some of them, it carried over into life, and they had a very difficult time with everything for a period of time, because they start to see themselves as a failure. They had this hope and dream that it's all they thought about for years, and now it's gone. And you think about it, you're in your mid-20s or late 20s, and your dream is over, and you're still young.
Yeah,
that can really mess with your head. But all of them, I don't think there was one that I remember speaking to who didn't sort of come back to baseball at some point later, if only as a fan, if only as someone who could finally go to the ballpark again and just enjoy a game. Whereas I think for many of them, for many years, they had a tough time doing that. But then over time, they started to develop a peace with it, some sort of understanding, whereas they could at least go and enjoy the things about the game that they always liked. And I think one player said that, the people in baseball are terrible, but the game itself is fantastic. And so at the end, it's the game you come back to, despite the people. And I found that to be a theme that ran through pretty much all of the players that I spoke with.
Today, you have to assume there's still things happening like this in baseball. Do you have any idea of what it's like now as a Black player trying to come up in the majors? Have there been strides or anything have been changed to make that better?
Well, I mean, there's one story, and this is, I think, Chuck Stone said that, he later became involved in scouting, and I think this was for the Astros organization, and we're talking at the early 2000s. His job was to find Black and Hispanic players. It's because I think he said he was from LA, and he also could speak Spanish. He was someone who could, talk to young people, whereas maybe some other people couldn't. And so he went and he put together scout teams of players, and none of his players would get signed by the Astros. And he finally went to the regional scouting director for the Astros. This is in 2010. So we're only talking 14 years ago. And that guy told him flat out, I'm never signing a Black player. And so that's 2010. Now that guy got, is no longer in the organization. So, and he wasn't like he was running the organization, but as Chuck Stone pointed out, you don't have to run the organization in order to really affect the organization, because as he said, it's a chain and you have to go up the chain. And if somebody is choking off talent at some point, then the talent never gets beyond that point. And until they fired that guy, then at least there were no Black players from his region getting signed by the Astros, and the people in the Astros above that guy may never have known any of that, right? How would they know? But either you have a guy here, you have a guy there. I'm sure this isn't the only guy, right? I'm sure the Astros organization isn't like that, but I'm sure there are people here all over the place, that have their own prejudices or whatever they have, and those people can sort of choke off talent. So that's pretty overt, but I also think that baseball they have that RBI program, and they have made a lot of strides. I mean, so it wouldn't be fair to say that they haven't. The problem is, as one person told me, that there's so many different contributing factors that it's not just as easy as having an RBI program. That's great. There's nothing wrong with that. I know that Clayton Kershaw has done a lot in terms of rebuilding recreation parks in inner city Los Angeles. He's really done a lot. Kevin Brown is another one who's done a lot, and that's great. But there's so many different factors. Also, one guy said a factor is that anybody who has a lot of talent who can play more than one sport, they're going to be encouraged to play the other sport because there's more. First of all, there's scholarships in basketball and in football, and there really aren't in baseball. There's partial scholarships, but it's a lot less than it is in the other two sports. And so anybody who has that talent in more than one sport would be crazy not to play the other sport. But as this one guy, I think this was Will Aaron, who said, that a big problem is college baseball. And if you look at college baseball, the College World Series becoming, or it's right now, right? Isn't the College World Series on right now? I think it is.
Yeah.
Just go look at the makeup of the teams. They're all white. I mean, they're almost all white. And his point was, well, yeah, this is the feeding ground for, not all of Major League Baseball, but a lot of players come out of there. And he says, well, they're all white. And they're all white because there's no real drive in the colleges to sign black players. They just don't. They don't want to have to spend money for financial aid or scholarship or whatever it is. It's easier to sign wealthier white kids. It's probably just less of an effort because you don't have to lay out the money. And when that happens, that's a big feeding ground. Another thing that I think harms young black players is, whereas maybe so a lot of players told me stories about scouts who wouldn't go into their neighborhoods. They would only stick to certain areas. And by the way, that's why if you look at ball players from decades and decades ago, a lot of them come from the same areas. It's not because certain areas were hotbeds. It's because the scouts just didn't leave those areas. They developed relationships there, and they kept signing players out of there. Those players are no better than any other players. It's just that that's where the scouts were from. So I know there are people who miss the old days of scouts. I'm not one of them. I think a lot of scouts were lazy, and they just didn't. They could do their job easier by not really working all that hard. And of course, there's exceptions, but probably more the rule was the lazy scout rather than the enterprising scout. But that was the problem decades ago. But now it's been replaced by a system where you really need to have your game honed by the time they look at you, which means that's a lot of money spent on travel ball. There's all these camps you can go to. There's a lot of equipment. You can spend a lot of money going to these camps where they can add 5 miles to your fastball. They can analyze your swing down to the the millisecond and help you, get a better launch angle. All those things are the things that determine who gets drafted and who doesn't. But all those things cost a lot of money. And if you don't have a lot of money, you're not going to get that training. You might be a better player than this other kid. But if that other kid's going to get all that training and expensive instruction and you don't, well, that kid's getting drafted and you're not. Doesn't mean anybody's racist per se. It just means that the game is in a way rigged. And if it's not rigged in your favor, you've got an extra hill to climb.
I coach high school ball, and there's such a barrier to entry for baseball. And I think this is a massive problem that we are facing where I don't have any kids, but I'm not excited about spending thousands and thousands of dollars and sending them to showcases, and they have, two $400 bats. And it's changed so much, and I don't know how to fix it. I think it's very broken, and I don't think we're realizing the repercussions of that yet. But on a happier note, so we're a literary baseball journal. I love the poems at the beginning of each chapter. How did those come about?
Oh, thanks. I didn't know I was going to read those, but
they're great. I loved it. Yeah, they're great.
So those came about because, well, I sort of have a little hobby that I like to do. Is I like to take snippets of somebody, a speech or whatever, and kind of make what I call found poetry out of them. And it's interesting that you can take a uh, an instruction manual, for example. Not all, you can,
Mhm.
and you can add some white space here, and you can break the lines up differently, and it will read completely differently, or it'll read as poetry. It was a fun thing to do and an interesting thing. I don't know. I got a weird sense of enjoyment, but I found that to be fun. So I was thinking like that when I was doing these interviews, but I also noticed that there were little snippets of things that some players would say. And again, I talked to them for a long time, and a lot of the stuff gets excised. You don't really, you can't put
Oh
all that
yeah.
in there. But I always found there was always a little snippet that to me rang as poetic, and I thought that I could take those little snippets and I could not change any words, but just sort of play with the spacing, or play with the line breaks or things like that. And I found that when I did that, it really it really resonated, and it really resonated emotionally in a way that it doesn't perhaps if you just look at it as part of a sentence or part of a paragraph. Because one of the challenges I thought in putting this together was that I wanted it I wanted it to read the way I felt when I heard the stories. And I have a little afterward in the book where I talk about that a little bit, where I said, I heard these stories, and when you hear them with your ears, they resonate in one way. But then when you read something, it's a totally different experience. And so the challenge was, how do I create something where somebody can read something and have it affect them emotionally just the way it affected me emotionally when I heard it. And I thought the closest I could come to that was in those found poems, because when you do that, certain words or phrases will resonate, whereas they wouldn't otherwise when you just read them. But when you hear them, like, I tried not to create anything false. I tried to create something that replicated the emotional reaction that I had. And I found that when I kind of spaced things out the way I spaced them, and grouped sentences the way I did, again, I didn't change anything. I didn't add anything. I didn't doctor anything other than just play with the spacing and the line breaks. But when you do that, I found that you're able to hopefully create an emotional response that somewhat mimics the emotional response I got when I heard them. So that was the reasoning behind those poems.
It was very impactful, and it got you ready for the chapter ahead. I thought it was great, and I'm very excited they're all found.
I kind of thought people would say, "Well, did he just make this up?" And the answer is no. This is exactly verbatim what they said in in order. I think, in other words, so like it wasn't like I took a sentence here and a sentence that they said an hour later. This was what they
Yeah,
said. All these words came together. This is a phrase or a couple of sentences they said at one point. So I didn't doctor it like that. I just changed the spacing
yeah,
and things like that.
that's
Um,
great. Your daughter also did the illustrations, right?
yes, she did. The illustrations came about because I started off with this idea that I would have photos of the players, and a couple of issues came up with that. First of all, I started to wonder, well, what is the value of a photo of a player nobody has seen? They don't know who they are, right? So is this just going
Yeah,
to be a person that doesn't mean anything? It's a picture of a person, but it's not a picture of Willie Mays. It's not a picture of Mookie Betts. It's not a picture of a person you know. So it's just a picture of a person. Uh, and so I was sort of concerned about the emotional resonance of those photos. I didn't know if they would do anything other than just count as photos in a book. So that was the first thing. But then also on top of that was that practically speaking, it's hard to find photos of a lot of these guys because, again, they didn't make it. And so, sometimes you can find pictures here and there. Um, it's also hard to get the rights to those photos, because those rights, if they were snapped on the field, they're the property of the team, or the photographer, depending. And now these minor league teams, this isn't like calling up the Oakland A's and asking them for permission. This is a minor league team that has been owned by maybe 40 different people since this guy played,
huh.
and in part of 7 or 8 different organizations. Nobody knows, what the chain is in terms of ownership. Nobody knows who owns these photos, and there wasn't that many of them anyway. So I got a few. They weren't that great, and then I realized, well, my daughter's an artist, And maybe there's an opportunity there to just like the poems, the found poems, to sort of represent something emotionally through the illustrations, um, that otherwise would be harder to get across. And so Jackie and I sat down and she read through all the chapters and we would talk about, what's a scene in this person's story that explains, if one picture would explain the most impactful part or the most crucial part of their story, what would it be? And sometimes they're pictures of a moment. Sometimes they're representative, right? One player said that when he signed, they didn't really give him anything. They gave him a couple of bucks, um, a glove, and a pair of shoes. And so
Yeah.
his picture is representation of a couple of bucks, a pair of shoes, and a glove.
Mhm.
So, we sat down, we talked about what might work. And so she drew a bunch of different things and we picked the ones that we thought were the most representative. And I think they came out great. I think they're another way to tell the story, just like the poems are. And so the idea with all of those things is different ways to emotionally reach a reader.
Yeah.
And I thought that just like the poems, this is another way. And I thought that at the end of the day, looking through those illustrations, I thought that they were great. And I thought that they really did a great job of telling the story. And you could just look at the illustrations and you would get a sense of who these people were, and what they went through, and an event that resonated with them or happened to them or things like that. And so I thought those were just another way to kind of flesh out the emotional impact of the stories. Because again, like I said, I'm also a law professor, and I was a practicing lawyer before that. I've read a lot of deposition transcripts, and they are not the most compelling reads. So I wanted to make sure that none of this came across as a deposition transcript. Instead, I want them to be emotionally compelling, along with being informational.
You touched on this at the very beginning. This was kind of a viral moment last month. A-Rod tosses Reggie Jackson just the most softball question ever about playing at Rickwood Field. And he really has this kind of raw response to that question. What was your reaction when you heard this?
Well, my first reaction was, "Man, I got a whole book of these stories."
Yeah, I know. Yeah, yeah. It's perfect. Yeah, it's exactly what your book's about. Yeah.
But I was glad that he said it because I enjoyed that game. I thought that game was a lot of fun to watch, and I thought that Major League Baseball did a good job, actually, in a lot of aspects. They brought back a bunch of older players and Negro League players, and there was a tribute to Willie Mays, and I thought all of that stuff was great. Um, I thought that some of the commentary was a little sepia nostalgic and sort of, oh,
Mhm.
look at this horrible thing that happened many decades ago. It wasn't that horrible, but now we're beyond that. And I thought that Reggie Jackson was great in that he sort of stopped that. Or he didn't stop it, but he kind of
Yeah.
brought everybody a moment of clarity and said, whoa, you know, everybody has these kind of nostalgic feelings towards Rickwood Field. Let me tell you what it was like for me. And he went through this story of basically the same thing that these guys told me about how horrible it was and how difficult it was and how he wouldn't have wished this. I think he said, I wouldn't wish this on anybody. And so while
Mhm.
everybody's celebrating Rickwood Field and people, I think, become nostalgic for a time that never existed, Reggie Jackson did a great job of pointing out, no, this existed and it was hell and it was horrible. And I don't wish that on anybody. And let me tell you what it was like. And it was really a smack in the face, I think, to a lot of people. And I know a lot of people got upset with it because they thought, well, we're all having a good time. And Reggie Jackson comes in there and drops this bomb in the middle of it and has to make it an ugly event. But he turned it into a realistic event. And
Yeah.
let people know that, hey, if we want to talk about history, let's talk about all of it and let's be honest about things. And maybe if we can, admit and confront these things, we can kind of work with them and see how we can improve them. And I thought I thought he did a great job. And I thought that it was nice to hear somebody say that. A-Rod wasn't going to say anything, but
No.
but Reggie Jackson, for everything that people say about him, he'll say what's on his mind, and people don't like it sometimes, but it's good that we have people like that.
That was Mitchell Nathanson. His book, Under Jackie's Shadow, Voices of Black Minor Leaguers Left Behind, is out now. We talk to people in and around baseball literature every week on the podcast and publish around 50 writers every year in the Twin Bill Literary Journal. You can support us on Patreon. Until next time,